The chandelier glinted over our dining table, but nothing shone brighter than my sister's triumphant smile as she held up the small drive. She thought she had stolen my secret life savings to erase her massive debts. She had no idea she was actually holding a Level 5 defense data core. By plugging it into her laptop, she had just triggered a 10-minute countdown until a heavily armed tactical strike team breached our front door. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Riley Hall. I am 32 years old, and for the past 7 years, I have lived a life carefully constructed of deliberate omissions. To my family, I am simply a low-level programmer at a tedious, no-name software startup. They think I spend my days fixing printer jams or writing lines of useless code in a gray cubicle. The truth is far less mundane. I work for Ethelgard Dynamics, a highly classified, privately contracted defense technology corporation. We develop artificial intelligence security systems for federal and military networks. The work we do does not exist on public records, and the non-disclosure agreements I signed are bound by federal treason laws. My family, however, has always been blissfully ignorant of my reality, largely because they have never been interested enough to ask. Their entire universe revolves around my older sister, Chloe. Chloe is the golden child, the vibrant, extroverted beauty who could do no wrong in the eyes of our parents. She has always been handed everything on a silver platter, her every whim catered to, her every mistake smoothed over. But recently, the golden child had tarnished her own crown. Over the past 2 years, Chloe had thrown herself into a reckless obsession with cryptocurrency, making catastrophic investments that wiped out her savings. She is currently drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, hounded by creditors, and desperately trying to maintain her lavish lifestyle. Our parents' solution to Chloe's financial ruin was as predictable as it was infuriating. In their minds, because I live alone, have no husband, and lead what they perceive as a shockingly boring life, my income is essentially communal family property. They firmly believe it is my fundamental duty to financially rescue my perfect sister. They have dropped endless hints, made aggressive passive-aggressive comments, and even outright demanded that I empty my accounts to cover Chloe's catastrophic losses. I have always refused, maintaining my gray rock facade. I let them think I am just stingy and poor. But their desperation reached a breaking point last week. It happened on a Friday evening. I walked into my home office, a room strictly off-limits to guests, and immediately felt a subtle shift in the air. The heavy wool rug had been pushed aside by perhaps 2 inches. Beneath the floorboards lay a small, biometric titanium safe. When I knelt and lifted the concealed panel, my blood turned to ice. The safe had been violently pried open. The metal was warped, scarred by what looked like a heavy crowbar. Inside, the velvet lining was empty. The encrypted black hard drive was gone. That drive contained a piece of highly sensitive, Level 5 artificial intelligence source code that I was temporarily auditing for an upcoming defense protocol update. It was a weapon in the wrong hands, and a federal offense to even possess without authorization. I did not need to dust for fingerprints or call the police to know who had taken it. The weekend prior, Chloe had invited herself over. She had spent 2 hours complaining about her bankrupt portfolios, pacing around my house. At one point, she claimed she had dropped an earring and needed to look for it in my office. I had let her in, assuming she was just being her usual nosy self. She must have seen the seam in the floorboards. She must have come back when I was at the laboratory. She thought she had found a physical cryptocurrency wallet, a cold storage drive containing the mythical millions she assumed I was hoarding. A normal person would have panicked. A normal sister would have called her family, screaming and crying, demanding the property back. I did none of those things. I simply stared at the ruined safe, feeling a terrifying, absolute calm wash over my mind. The suffocating weight of my family's entitlement had finally crossed a line from toxic annoyance into federal espionage. Without making a single sound, I picked up my secure phone and dialed the direct line to the Director of Internal Security at Ethelgard Dynamics. I did not sugarcoat the situation. I reported a Level 5 data breach, gave them the exact serial number of the stolen drive, and identified the suspect. The director's voice was devoid of emotion as he told me to stand down, maintain normal behavior, and wait for their tactical response instructions. I hung up the phone, placed it back on the desk, and poured myself a glass of water. 2 days later, the trap was set. My mother sent a group text, issuing a mandatory family dinner summons for Friday night. The excuse she provided was that we needed to celebrate a massive upcoming promotion Chloe was supposedly receiving at her marketing job. It was a laughable lie. Chloe was barely holding on to her current position, let alone getting promoted. I knew exactly what this dinner was. It was a carefully orchestrated theater production. It was a stage set for blatant, aggressive extortion. They were going to corner me, reveal their stolen prize, and demand I hand over the passwords to the fortune they believed was locked inside that drive. I replied to the message with a simple confirmation: I will be there at 7 o'clock. As I ironed my dress for the evening, I felt no anger, only the cold, mechanical precision of a system preparing to execute a flawless deletion. They wanted my secrets. Tonight, they would get them all. I arrived at my parents' sprawling suburban estate at precisely 7 o'clock in the evening. The sweeping circular driveway was already choked with unnecessarily large luxury vehicles, a gleaming facade hiding the rot beneath. Inside, the massive dining room was a grotesque monument to performative wealth. A heavy mahogany table groaned under the weight of an excessive, 6-course culinary display. There were sterling silver platters piled high with artisan cheeses, imported black truffles, and thick cuts of prime Wagyu beef. 3 bottles of a $2,000 vintage red wine stood open, breathing their expensive arrogance into the stifling air. It was a pathetic irony, considering the heavy second mortgage my parents had secretly taken out just 14 months ago. They were drowning just as fast as their favorite daughter, desperately masking the smell of impending ruin with the scent of roasted rosemary and pure, unadulterated panic. Chloe made her grand entrance 20 minutes late, ensuring she had a captive audience upon arrival. She was draped in a brand-new, blindingly white designer dress that likely cost more than a reliable used car. Clinging tightly to her arm was her fiancé, Marcus. Marcus was a man whose entire personality was built around his heavily gelled hair and his loud, hollow laugh. He was a junior wealth manager who had managed absolutely no wealth. A corporate parasite dressed in a tailored Italian suit he had undoubtedly purchased on a high-interest credit card. They floated into the room on a cloud of nauseatingly strong perfume and forced cheerfulness, immediately commandeering the entire conversation. My mother rushed forward instantly, her heavily manicured hands fluttering wildly as she kissed both of Chloe's cheeks. "Oh, darling, you look absolutely radiant," she cooed, pouring Chloe a generous, overflowing glass of the vintage wine. "Success truly suits you, my sweet girl." My father joined the spectacle, clapping Marcus heartily on the back with a booming laugh. "A toast to our star executive and her brilliant partner," he roared. I sat quietly at the far end of the long table, entirely ignored until they needed a convenient target for their thinly veiled hostility. The extravagant meal commenced, a synchronized performance of clinking silverware and sharp, calculated jabs aimed directly at my throat. "Riley," my mother began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she sliced aggressively into her rare steak. "Are you still at that same little computer company? You must be so incredibly bored sitting in a gray cubicle for 40 hours a week. It is such a crying shame you lack your sister's natural ambition. You know, Chloe is managing a team of 20 people now." Chloe giggled, a sharp, grating sound that echoed off the crystal chandelier. "Oh, leave her alone, Mom. Not everyone is cut out for the high-stakes corporate world. Some people just prefer to play it incredibly safe and count their pennies alone in the dark," Marcus chimed in, swirling the dark red liquid in his heavy crystal glass, trying to look sophisticated. Exactly. Speaking of pennies, Riley, you really should let me look at your financial portfolio sometime soon. I mean, keeping everything locked away in low-yield savings accounts is practically a crime in this economy. You have to take massive risks if you want to play with the big boys. I am quite comfortable with my current arrangements, I replied. My voice was utterly flat, devoid of any defensive inflection or emotion. My father let out a loud, highly patronizing sigh, shaking his graying head in mock disappointment. Comfortable. That is the fundamental problem with your generation, Riley. You are too focused on hoarding what little you have instead of building a family empire. It is selfish. Frankly speaking, a family should support each other, not hide away in cheap apartments acting like a paranoid miser. I said absolutely nothing in return. I simply lifted my plain glass of tap water, taking a slow, highly measured sip. Let them talk. Let them gorge themselves on the expensive, catered food they could not afford to pay for. I observed their tragic theater with the absolute stillness of an executioner watching a condemned prisoner enjoy a lavish final meal. Every single insult, every condescending glare, was just another heavy brick they were happily laying for their own legal tomb. They mistook my chilling silence for passive submission. They did not realize it was simply the quiet, breathless moment before the slaughter began. The suffocating charade reached its nauseating peak right after the fine porcelain dessert plates were cleared away by the hired staff. My father, his face flushed red with expensive alcohol and misplaced patriarchal authority, stood up heavily from his oak chair. He picked up a silver dessert spoon and clinked it sharply against his wineglass. The high-pitched ringing sound commanded immediate, absolute attention across the room. "If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment," he announced. His chest puffed out proudly. He looked around the long table, his eyes deliberately and heavily lingering on me. "Tonight, we are here to celebrate Chloe's incredible, undeniable success. But, as we all know, the road to greatness is sometimes paved with temporary, minor setbacks. Our darling Chloe has encountered a slight, unforeseen cash flow issue." He paused dramatically, letting the heavy, uncomfortable silence settle over the dining room. His tone shifted rapidly from jovial to gravely serious, a masterclass in emotional manipulation perfected over 30 years. "Family," he continued, placing both of his large hands flat on the polished table and leaning forward aggressively, "is entirely about sacrifice. It is about lifting each other up when times get a little tough. Your mother and I have given so much of our lives to ensure our children have a permanent safety net. And now, tonight, it is time for a little internal redistribution of resources to help Chloe secure her bright, beautiful future." The entire table went perfectly, terrifyingly still. My mother, Chloe, and Marcus all turned their heads in absolute, terrifying unison. Their eyes locked onto me, wide with a hungry, predatory expectation. It was an exploitative reflex, a parasitic habit that had been deeply ingrained in their blood for decades. They honestly, truly believed I was about to bow my head and surrender everything I owned just because they demanded it. The silence stretching across the dining room shattered when Chloe suddenly threw her head back and let out a shrill, victorious laugh. The sound cut through the heavy air like a jagged knife. She reached down into her expensive leather handbag, her manicured fingers digging around for a moment before pulling out a small, heavy object. With a theatrical flourish, she raised her arm high and slammed the object down right in the center of the mahogany table. It landed with a loud, dense thud, resting aggressively right next to a delicate crystal wineglass. It was the black, encrypted hard drive. My hard drive. The matte black finish of the military-grade casing seemed to absorb the light from the chandelier above, sitting like a small, dark explosive device amidst the scattered crumbs of artisan cheese and smeared grease of Wagyu beef. Chloe leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. A smug, radiant grin stretched across her heavily contoured face. "Look what I found," she mocked, her voice dripping with venomous triumph. Your little savings account. She pointed a single, perfectly painted fingernail at the device. You really thought you were so clever, didn't you? Living in that depressing little house, wearing cheap clothes, acting like you barely had 2 dimes to rub together. But I knew there was absolutely no way you were just surviving on a basic tech support salary while doing absolutely nothing with your life. So, when I was at your place last weekend, I did a little digging. Imagine my absolute shock when I found a hidden floor safe in your incredibly boring home office. My mother drew a sharp breath, her hands flying to cover her mouth in a display of sheer theatrics. Her eyes, however, betrayed her, gleaming with raw, unmistakable greed rather than any actual shock at my confession about accidentally uncovering such a massive fortune. That is a physical cold storage wallet for cryptocurrency, Chloe announced to the table, her tone carrying the absolute certainty of a complete fool. I did my research. People use these specific, heavy-duty drives to store off-grid digital assets. Bitcoin, Ethereum, you name it. Our quiet, selfish little sister has been secretly hoarding hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of dollars in virtual currency while watching me drown in debt. She was perfectly willing to let our parents take out a second mortgage rather than share her massive, hidden fortune. Instead of being utterly horrified that their daughter had broken into my home, destroyed my personal property, and committed grand larceny, my parents erupted into spontaneous applause. My father actually clapped his large hands together, a wide, flushed smile breaking across his wrinkled face. I knew it, my father bellowed, pointing a thick finger at me. I always knew you were hiding something from us. This is exactly what I was talking about. This is the universe bringing balance back to this household. It is a completely fair redistribution of wealth. You have hoarded this for years while your own flesh and blood suffered. Chloe simply took the initiative to secure what rightfully belongs to the family trust. Oh, my brilliant girl. My mother wept fake, joyful tears, reaching over to squeeze Chloe's shoulder. You saved us. You saved your own future. And Riley, frankly, you should be deeply ashamed of yourself for making us go through all this terrible financial stress when you had the solution locked under your floorboards the entire time. To my right, Marcus was practically vibrating with physical excitement. He had abandoned all pretense of wealthy sophistication. He was staring at the small black drive with an intensity that was genuinely repulsive. His mouth was slightly open, and I could practically see the gears grinding in his empty head as he began mentally spending funds that did not exist. A cold wallet, Marcus whispered, licking his dry lips. Do you have any idea what the current market value is? If she bought in 5 years ago, the multipliers are astronomical. We are talking generational wealth sitting right there on the wood. Chloe, babe, we can finally buy that custom Italian sports car I was looking at, the one with over 600 horsepower that goes from 0 to 60 in 2.9 seconds. We could pay straight cash. The sheer, unadulterated delusion in the room was almost thick enough to choke on. They were a pack of starving hyenas fighting over a painted plastic bone, entirely unaware that the bone was actually wired to a landmine. I placed my water glass down on the table. The soft click of the glass against the wood drew their attention for a fraction of a second. I looked directly at Chloe, then at my father, my expression perfectly blank. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I spoke with the slow, measured cadence of a doctor delivering a fatal diagnosis. Listen to me very carefully, I said, my voice cutting through their manic celebrations like ice. Do not touch that device. Do not attempt to plug it in. Do not attempt to open it. That is not a cryptocurrency wallet. There is absolutely zero money on that hardware. What is actually on that drive is something you cannot possibly comprehend, and the legal consequences of you possessing it will destroy your lives in ways you cannot even begin to imagine. Push it across the table to me right now, and I will walk out of this house, and we will never speak again. For exactly 2 seconds, the room was completely silent. Then, Chloe burst into a loud, mocking shriek of laughter. Marcus joined in, slamming his hand on the table in amusement, while my parents shook their heads in utter disgust. Nice try, Chloe sneered, wiping a tear of mirth from her eye. You are pathetic. You are actually sitting there trying to scare us with vague legal threats because you are absolutely panicking. You are terrified because your selfish little secret is finally out in the open, and you know we are about to drain every single digital cent you have been hiding. My father leaned forward, his face contorted in an ugly, bullying sneer. Enough of the lies. You are completely cornered. You have no power here anymore. You are going to give Chloe the decryption passwords right now, or we will simply hire a professional hacker to crack it open for us. Your pathetic attempts to intimidate us are completely useless. They had made their choice. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap, and let the silence answer for me. To prove her absolute dominance over the situation, Chloe scoffed loudly and reached down into her oversized designer tote bag, resting on the thick carpet. She pulled out a sleek, rose gold personal laptop, dropping it heavily onto the dining table right in the middle of the expensive silverware and half-empty wine glasses. She flipped the lid open. The bright, cheerful glow of her commercial operating system illuminated her smug, arrogant features. She logged in, her fingers aggressively hammering the keys, preparing to expose my imaginary fortune to the room. I looked at the glowing screen, then at the heavy black drive sitting inches away from her hand. The tension in the dining room was so thick it felt like trying to breathe underwater. I had to offer them one final, explicit chance to step away from the edge of the cliff. It was not out of familial love, but a rigid adherence to Ethelgard Dynamics' standard operating procedures regarding civilian asset recovery. Chloe, I am speaking to you with absolute, deadly seriousness, I said, my voice dropping an octave, echoing with a hollow, metallic coldness that briefly wiped the smile off my mother's face. That hardware requires a localized, heavily encrypted intranet connection to function. If you insert that device into a commercial machine connected to a public, unsecured internet network, an automated failsafe will instantly engage. A highly classified emergency distress signal will immediately broadcast across a global surveillance system. You will trigger an irreversible chain of events. My father slammed his fist onto the mahogany wood, rattling the crystal glasses. Shut your mouth, Riley. Stop making up these ridiculous science fiction stories. You are stalling, Chloe. Plug the damn thing in and let us see the money. Chloe did not hesitate for a single second, ignoring every word of reason, driven entirely by blind, ravenous greed. She snatched the heavy black drive from the table. She aligned it with the universal serial bus port on the side of her rose gold laptop and shoved it in forcefully. There was a sharp, distinct mechanical click. It took exactly a quarter of a second for the world as they knew it to end. There was no loading icon. There was no friendly notification asking for a password. Instantly, the cheerful wallpaper of Chloe's laptop vanished, violently replaced by a blinding, blood-red screen. A massive wall of dense, terrifying white code began cascading down the monitor at a dizzying speed, aggressively rewriting the core registry of her machine. Simultaneously, a piercing, high-pitched beep erupted, but it did not come from the computer speakers. It came directly from the black drive itself. The sound was deafening, a synthetic, rhythmic screech that cut through the eardrums like a physical blade. It was the auditory confirmation that a global positioning system lockdown protocol had been successfully activated. The drive was now a screaming beacon, broadcasting our exact coordinates to a subterranean server room located 3 states away. Chloe screamed, leaping back from her chair as if the computer had physically burned her. "What is happening? What did you do to my computer?" she shrieked, waving her hands frantically. "Turn it off. Riley, turn the alarm off right now." Marcus panicked. His eyes were wide with sudden, primal terror as the deafening alarm continued to screech. He lunged forward, grabbing the side of the laptop with his left hand while his right hand clamped down on the black drive. He planted his feet and yanked backward with all his strength, desperately trying to sever the connection. The drive did not move. It was completely fused to the machine, as part of an extreme physical security mechanism engineered by Ethelgard Dynamics. The moment the drive detected an unauthorized network, microscopic titanium barbs deployed outward from the connector, anchoring themselves permanently into the motherboard of the host device. It was an ironclad lockdown. Marcus grunted, pulling harder. He pulled with so much frantic force that he dragged the entire laptop across the table, knocking over 2 expensive wine bottles. Dark red liquid spilled out like fresh blood, soaking into the pristine white linen tablecloth and dripping onto the hardwood floor. "It is stuck," Marcus yelled over the deafening alarm. "The damn thing will not come out. It is locked inside the port." In my right pocket, my secure phone vibrated exactly 1 time, a single, heavy pulse. I did not need to pull it out to read the encrypted message. The automated response system at the corporate security center had just confirmed the coordinates were locked. The breach was verified. A heavily armed rapid response tactical team was officially inbound and moving into combat position. The point of no return was far behind us now. The atmosphere of victorious celebration at the dining table completely evaporated, replaced instantly by an atmosphere of suffocating, chaotic terror. My mother was clutching her chest, breathing in short, panicked gasps as she stared at the ruined wine and the screaming machine. My father stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, unable to process the total loss of control. Then, the cascading white code on the monitor suddenly stopped. The blood-red background remained, but massive, bold black letters materialized in the center of the screen. The text was terrifyingly clear. Warning: critical federal security violation. Unauthorized access of Level 5, classified defense material. The Espionage Act of 1917 has been invoked. Do not attempt to power down this device. Do not attempt to leave the premises. Federal authorities have been dispatched to your exact location. Chloe read the words out loud, her voice cracking, devolving into a hysterical sob. Level 5 classified defense material? Espionage? Riley, what is this? What kind of sick prank is this? I remained perfectly seated, my hands still neatly folded in my lap, calmly watching the red light from the monitor wash over their terrified, pale faces. They had wanted my secrets, and now they were drowning in them. The screeching, synthetic alarm of the hard drive was suddenly swallowed by a massive, overwhelming mechanical roar that vibrated through the very foundation of the estate. The thumping noise rapidly escalated from a distant rumble into an ear-splitting typhoon of sound. It felt as though a heavy military transport helicopter was attempting to land directly on top of the slate roof of my parents' mansion. The massive crystal chandelier suspended above the dining table began to sway violently, the delicate glass pendants smashing into one another and shattering onto the ruined feast below. A fraction of a second later, the piercing shriek of burning rubber tore through the quiet. Affluent suburban neighborhood. 6 heavily armored, matte black tactical assault vehicles skidded to a violent halt, completely blockading the circular driveway, crushing the expensive landscaping, and tearing deep trenches into the perfectly manicured lawn. There was no polite knock at the heavy oak front door. There was no formal announcement or verbal request for entry. The institutional response to a Level 5 defense material breach was absolute, overwhelming, and devastating kinetic force. A tremendous ballistic explosion shattered the front entrance, ripping the custom wooden door entirely off its reinforced steel hinges and sending heavy lethal splinters flying across the marble foyer. Simultaneously, the massive, floor-to-ceiling tempered glass windows in the adjacent living room exploded inward. A terrifying, glittering shower of jagged glass rained down onto the expensive Persian rugs as dozens of heavily armed tactical operators poured into the house like a flood of unstoppable black water. They moved with terrifying, synchronized military precision, clad in full composite body armor, heavy ballistic helmets, and night vision optics, wielding compact assault rifles equipped with blinding strobe lights. The chaotic, intersecting beams of bright white light sliced rapidly through the dining room, illuminating the paralyzed, bloodless faces of my family. The deafening commands echoed from multiple directions. overlapping into a suffocating wall of aggressive noise. The captain of the Ethelgard Dynamics Rapid Response Team stormed straight into the dining room. He was a massive, imposing juggernaut of a man, his face entirely obscured by a black tactical balaclava, leaving only his cold, highly trained eyes visible. He radiated pure, lethal intent. He did not hesitate to assess the situation. He locked eyes with Chloe, who was still standing frozen in sheer terror near the screaming laptop. In one fluid, practiced motion, the captain raised his customized sidearm, the red laser sight cutting straight through the dusty air and settling directly in the dead center of Chloe's forehead. "Step away from the device immediately. Keep your hands high where I can see them, or I will eliminate the threat right now. Get down on the floor," he roared, his voice completely devoid of any human empathy or hesitation. My father, utterly blinded by his own lifelong arrogance and completely incapable of comprehending that he was no longer the supreme authority in the room, made a catastrophic, life-altering mistake. He puffed up his chest, his face turning purple with indignant rage, and took a heavy, aggressive step toward the heavily armed captain. "Now you listen to me," my father bellowed, raising a thick finger in a pathetic, desperate attempt to assert his patriarchal dominance over the tactical unit. "This is my private property. You have absolutely no legal right to barge in here like a gang of street thugs. I demand to know who is in charge of this ridiculous stunt." He did not even get the chance to finish his sentence. Two tactical operators flanked him instantly, moving faster than the eye could track. One operator grabbed my father's extended arm, twisted it violently up behind his back until the shoulder joint popped, and kicked the back of his knee with brutal force. The other operator shoved a heavily armored shoulder directly into my father's chest. The proud patriarch of the family was slammed face down onto the hardwood floor with a sickening, heavy thud. A thick combat boot was planted firmly and painfully between his shoulder blades, pinning him completely to the ground as heavy plastic zip ties were brutally ratcheted around his wrists, cutting off the circulation. He let out a muffled, pathetic groan of pain. His illusion of untouchable control shattered into a million pieces in less than 3 seconds. Marcus did not even attempt to put up a fight. The moment the windows had exploded, he had dropped entirely to his knees, throwing his trembling hands high in the air and loudly, hysterically sobbing. His cowardice did not save him from the absolute aggression of the strike team. Two operators grabbed him roughly by the collar of his tailored Italian suit, hauling him violently to his feet. "I had nothing to do with this," Marcus screamed hysterically, tears streaming down his face as they wrenched his arms back and secured his wrists with thick plastic cuffs. "She brought it here. It was all Chloe's idea. I swear to God, I do not even know what that thing is." My mother began to shriek, a high-pitched, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated psychological breakdown. She watched in sheer, helpless terror as her prized future son-in-law was dragged violently out of the dining room by his collar, his expensive leather shoes scraping uselessly against the broken glass. He was being hauled away like a dangerous terrorist for the federal crime of complicity in the theft of top-secret government technology. My mother collapsed against the wall, sliding down to the floor, her manicured hands tearing frantically at her perfectly styled hair as she wailed uncontrollably, completely broken by the sudden, violent destruction of her perfect world. The chaotic noise in the room began to stabilize as the operators secured the perimeter and established total, undisputed dominance over the hostile environment. The captain lowered his weapon slightly, keeping a watchful, predatory eye on a hyperventilating Chloe, who had finally dropped flat onto her stomach, trembling so violently her teeth were chattering. He stepped carefully around the spilled vintage wine and approached the dining table. He pulled a specialized, electromagnetically shielded evidence bag from his tactical vest. With extreme precision, he executed a rapid manual override sequence on the laptop's motherboard, successfully neutralizing the microscopic titanium lock barbs before carefully extracting the heavy black hard drive. He dropped the screaming device into the bag, sealing it tightly. The agonizing noise instantly vanished, leaving only the pathetic sound of my mother's sobbing and the heavy, ragged breathing of the terrified prisoners on the floor. The captain secured the laptop as secondary evidence, slinging it over his broad shoulder. Then, the entire power dynamic of the room visibly shifted. The imposing, heavily armed tactical leader turned his back entirely on my whimpering family. He walked directly over to where I was still sitting calmly at the end of the long table. He stopped, snapped his heavy boots together, and lowered his head in a deep, highly respectful, subordinate bow. "Director Hall," the captain said, his voice completely changing from a roaring, lethal threat to a tone of absolute, unwavering professional reverence. "The classified asset is secure. The breach has been successfully contained. We are awaiting your final tactical orders, ma'am." I slowly stood up from my chair, calmly smoothing out the fabric of my dress. I looked down the length of the ruined dining table. My father was securely pinned to the floor, his face pressed humiliatingly against the smeared grease of the Wagyu beef. My mother was a crumpled, sobbing mess in the corner, rocking back and forth. Chloe was staring up at me from the floor, her mouth hanging wide open, her eyes wide with a horrified realization that completely transcended her physical fear. The truth hit them all simultaneously, hitting vastly harder than the physical force of the breach itself. The quiet, boring, heavily despised daughter they had spent a lifetime mocking, exploiting, and stealing from was not a pathetic, low-level programmer. They were watching, paralyzed by absolute shock, as I stood at the absolute pinnacle of power in a room filled with lethal federal operatives. I looked at the captain, my expression as cold and unyielding as the shattered marble in the destroyed foyer. "Transport all hostile subjects to the Black Site facility for Level 4 interrogation," I ordered, my voice ringing out clearly and ruthlessly in the silent room. "Bag their heads. I do not want them seeing the rout." 72 hours later, the performative illusions of my family were entirely dismantled under the blinding, sterile fluorescent lights of an Ethelgard dynamic subterranean interrogation room. The room was a freezing cube of solid steel and reinforced concrete, completely devoid of warmth, empathy, or sunlight. It was here, sitting across a cold metal table, that the absolute reality of my existence was finally laid bare before them. They were no longer looking at a compliant, boring daughter or a pathetic sister. They were looking at the senior director of intelligence security, a woman holding clearance levels they could not even mentally process, backed by the full, terrifying weight of the federal government. Chloe was completely broken. The radiant, arrogant woman who had worn designer dresses and mocked my lifestyle just 3 days ago was gone. In her place sat a hollow, trembling shell of a human being, clad in an abrasive, bright orange federal holding uniform. Her perfectly styled hair was a matted mess, and her heavily contoured face was pale and stained with endless, useless tears. A grim-faced federal prosecutor sat beside me, ruthlessly reading the permanent charges from a thick manila folder. She was being formally indicted for first-degree industrial espionage, unauthorized possession and attempted distribution of Level 5 classified military technology, and domestic cyber terrorism. Because the stolen drive contained defensive artificial intelligence source code, the mandatory minimum sentence she was facing was 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. There was no leniency, there was no possibility of parole, because she was considered an active, extreme flight risk and a threat to national security. Bail was absolutely denied. Her entire future, the bright, wealthy life she had felt so fundamentally entitled to, was permanently erased with the strike of a judge's gavel. My parents did not fare any better, because they had actively encouraged, celebrated, and attempted to profit from the theft of government property in their own home. They were formally charged as criminal co-conspirators. Under the strict enforcement of federal asset forfeiture laws, every single bank account they possessed was immediately frozen, their retirement funds, their hidden offshore accounts, and their heavily leveraged stock portfolios were completely seized pending a massive government investigation. The sprawling suburban estate they loved to show off to their high society friends was confiscated by federal marshals within 48 hours. Their entire social circle, terrified of being linked to a federal espionage ring, abandoned them instantly. The legacy of wealth and superiority they had spent their entire adult lives building was reduced to absolute zero. They were left with nothing but the orange jumpsuits on their backs. During a strictly monitored final visitation session, my mother threw herself against the thick, bulletproof glass dividing the room. Her face was distorted by raw, unimaginable panic. She wept hysterically, begging and pleading with me to intervene. "Riley, please," she sobbed, her hands sliding desperately down the reinforced glass. "You have to stop this. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them we did not know. We are your family. We share the same blood. You cannot just throw your own sister and your parents away to rot in a cage for the rest of their lives. Please, have some mercy on us." I stood up slowly from my chair. I walked over to the glass partition, looking directly into her wild, terrified eyes. I felt no pity. I felt no residual familial bond. All I felt was the quiet, satisfying hum of a system correcting a fatal error. "There is no misunderstanding," I replied, my voice completely flat and devoid of emotion, transmitting clearly through the small metal speaker box. "You chose to view me as a mindless financial tool. You chose to steal from me. You chose to ignore every explicit warning I gave you because you believed your greed made you untouchable. I am not throwing you away. You built this cage with your own hands. Thieves must pay the agonizing price for their own bottomless greed. This is your final payment." I turned my back on her agonized screams and walked out of the interrogation room, never looking back. Over the next 48 hours, I systematically erased my civilian footprint. I sent a specialized cleanup crew to empty my old, unremarkable house. Every piece of paperwork, every photograph, and every meaningless token of my past life was thrown into a high-temperature incinerator. I legally severed all ties, removing myself completely from any familial registries or legal associations with the individuals currently awaiting federal transport. They were no longer my blood. They were simply neutralized threats. The true climax of this ordeal did not happen in a courtroom. It happened late on a Tuesday night, standing quietly in the shadows of the loading bay at the detention facility. The cold rain was falling heavily, washing the concrete clean. I watched in absolute silence as a massive, heavily armored federal prison transport bus idled its engine. The heavy steel doors slid open, and I watched the chained, defeated figures of my sister, my mother, and my father being loaded into the dark, windowless back of the vehicle. They shuffled forward, their heads bowed, completely stripped of their arrogance and their identities. As the heavy iron doors slammed shut and the massive armored vehicle rolled slowly out of the gate, disappearing forever into the black, unforgiving night, a profound realization settled over me. The absolute collapse of an empty, parasitic family was not a tragedy. It was the necessary, brutal price of true freedom. I took a deep breath of the cold, crisp air. For the first time in 32 years, I felt completely weightless. I smiled, a genuine, quiet expression of profound relief. I turned around and stepped into the back of a sleek, black government vehicle waiting nearby. The heavy door clicked shut behind me, completely sealing away the dark, suffocating burden of my past. The engine hummed to life, carrying me forward into a bright, unwritten future, a new life that finally, completely, belonged only to me. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Boss Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we would love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you are listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.